Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge the adoption of my amendment to ensure that President Biden's Lend-Lease authority regarding Ukraine is subject to the same requirements, and I'll say that again, the same requirements under the Arms Export Control Act and the Foreign Assistance Act as loans to every other country. These requirements would not block or do not block any of the current support that our government is providing to Ukraine, but would mitigate the risk that the Biden administration, or for that matter, any administration, abuses its Lend-Lease authorities in the future. The requirements include that the loan is made for a fixed period of time, up to 5 years, and the borrower agree to repay us all the costs we incur by lending our equipment, such as repair or to replace damaged equipment. Loans have agreements for repayment. Without the requirements that loans have a defined term and a repayment agreement, without those terms, it's not a loan, it's a grant or it's a gift. Funding Ukraine is under the purview of Congress, not the executive branch. He could simply call it a loan and never require repayment or reimbursement, or could extend the terms out indefinitely or request repayment in something else like monopoly money, and I say that in jest. Other requirements under the Arms Export Control Act include that the President determine that there are compelling foreign policy or national security reasons to lend the equipment rather than actually just selling it. And he considers any impact the loan may have on our national technology and industrial base. Surely, none of us want the President to lend equipment if he doesn't believe we have a compelling national interest to be involved, or without consideration of the impact to our industrial base. Finally, it requires the President provide detailed reports to the Foreign Affairs and Appropriations Committees when he exercises the Lend-Lease authorities, a very reasonable requirement consistent with basic congressional oversight. I urge support of my amendment and reserve.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I claim time in opposition to the amendment and yield myself as much time as I consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to the amendment, which would eliminate the important extension of Lend-Lease authority for Ukraine included in the underlying bill. As Ukraine continues its counteroffensive against Russia's brutal, unprovoked war of aggression, we must continue doing everything we can with our allies and partners and support, not just for the future of Ukraine and its people, but for democracies and free people across the world opposing brutal autocrats like Putin. The Lend-Lease authority this bill extends is one of the many tools the administration has at its disposal to support Ukraine in its courageous efforts with critical weapons and defense capabilities. This authority is one which has bipartisan support, not just in committee by virtue of the extension being included in the bill, but by way of bicameral bipartisan passage and strong support roughly 10 months ago. It was a Republican, led by Senator John Cornyn, S. 3522, which provided for Lend-Lease authority for Ukraine, that passed by an overwhelming bipartisan margin, 417 to 10, in favor, including nearly 200 Republicans. I call on members to recognize the importance of ensuring Ukraine has the tools and capabilities it needs to defend itself, defeat Russia, and preserve its independence and sovereignty, and I urge a no vote. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I believe in freedom. I believe in liberty. I believe in the right for a country to defend itself, but I also believe in accountability. These are taxpayer dollars being used overseas. We have an authority, we have a responsibility as Congress to oversee these dollars. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Nebraska, Representative Bacon.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With regret, I have to oppose my colleague's amendment from Tennessee. I believe it's in our national security interest that Ukraine remain independent. If they fall, what happens next? What does the bully do next? He threatens the Baltics. He's already called them renegade states. That's a threat. You stop a bully when he's pushing you around, and that's what Putin is doing. He's invaded a country 1/4 of his size and population. They cannot win without our help. It's not Americans doing the fighting, it's Ukrainians doing the fighting, but they cannot prevail without our material support. And thus far, we've provided about 5% of what our military budget equates to. For 5%, half of Russia's tanks have been destroyed, and almost 200,000 Russians have been killed while they're invading the Ukrainians. We have spent this money in a way that is helping our national interests prevail, and it's helping Ukraine survive, and it will prevent what I believe is the next phase if we stop them here, which is the Baltics or Poland. So I recommend my colleagues to vote against this amendment, and I yield.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman of Tennessee is recognized.
While members of Congress have diverse views on the conflict in Ukraine and the appropriate role of the United States, which we've talked about a lot when considering this bill, I hope we can broadly agree that Congress must exercise its responsibility to guide and oversee the use of our taxpayer dollars and our defense equipment. I reserve.
Shelley from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from South Carolina, Representative Wilson.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's so important with Lend-Lease that we make every effort to provide the people of Ukraine who are fighting so valiantly. Many of us thought that they simply couldn't resist, but they are. And they're resisting because they are getting the equipment, but the quickest way to get the equipment is through Lend-Lease. And I'm very grateful that last year, as has already been identified, we voted here in Congress 417 to 10 to provide for the Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act. It provides for great accountability. And then, ironically, I've actually seen success of Lend-Lease. I was in St. Petersburg, Russia, to place a wreath at the world's largest open cemetery, the victims of the siege of Leningrad. And the only reason that the Russians were successful in stopping Hitler is because the equipment was provided by the United States through Lend-Lease. And so it's now ironic that we need to be providing Lend-Lease equipment to Ukraine to stop war criminal Putin. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman of Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to reiterate that we're not saying that the Lend-Lease program can't be utilized. We're simply asking that Congress has the ability to set forth terms, as is our responsibility. We have an obligation to the American taxpayer to have accountability for these dollars. It's Lend-Lease. It's not a gift. If it's a gift, we should authorize it, but it's not. It's either Lend-Lease or it is not. Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have?
A minute and a half left.
I yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Washington State, Representative Smith.
Thank you very much. A couple of things. First of all, we haven't actually used the Lend-Lease provision yet, so there's nothing to exercise oversight on. It's not clear whether or not it will be used. But I want to address the larger issue which has been raised, and that is the idea that there was a lack of accountability for the funds going to Ukraine. That is, number one, a big Russian Putin propaganda talking point, and number two, completely wrong. It has been investigated by the IG and a whole bunch of other folks and determined that that is not happening. These weapons are going precisely where they are supposed to be going. And we know this because if they weren't, Ukraine would have lost a long time ago. They are under attack from a military roughly 5 times the size of theirs that is much more well-armed, much more well-equipped. In order to defend themselves, they have to effectively use the support that the United States and, again, 53 other nations are providing to them. They have been effectively using that, which is how they have been able to retake some of the territory that Russia took from them a year and a half ago and protect the rest of the country that Putin was trying to take. So let's not buy into this myth that somehow this money's being wasted, there's not proper oversight. There's a legitimate argument to be had about where you feel about the importance of Ukraine. But it is not based on this money being wasted. The money has been incredibly effectively used. That's why Ukraine has been able to effectively defend itself. And again, I believe we should help Ukraine defend itself, which is what we are doing. And as with all the other amendments along these lines, I urge opposition to this one.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentleman's recognized.
How much time, Mr. Speaker?
1 minute left.
Mr. Speaker, and to my colleagues, I appreciate the robust debate, and I just want to emphasize that under the Lend-Lease program, there are terms set forth. This is something that we owe the American people. It is something that we would expect if it's utilized for other countries. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge adoption of my amendment, and I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee. Those in favor say aye.